Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Let's Combinate Drugs and Devices. I'm your host, Subhi Saadeh, and we are graced and honored today by Mark Kramer, who is recognized as the founding director of FDA's OCP, that's the Office of Combination Products. He's a leading expert now in U.S. combination product regulation, and he was the one who led OCP at its creation. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here with you.
Yeah, honors mine. One of the things that is hard for me to understand, given that I basically worked in combination products my whole career, and I was around when part four came out, but there's a lot of background that I wasn't privy to because it wasn't part of my lived experience. It's all historical, let's say. So I know that the FDA defined combination products in 1990 and that there was a modernization exercise that happened that drove the creation of OCP. That's all I know. So could you maybe walk through the background, the history, the details? What was it like? What problems was industry and FDA dealing with such that it drove the creation?
Sure. Well, yeah, it really started, like you said, in 1990. There was the Safe Medical Devices Act of 1990, for the first time defined a combination product and said very little about combination products other than that they should be assigned to agency centers. That would be CBER, CDER, and CDRH that we know today, based on the primary mode of action of the combination product. And following that legislation, the Office of the Ombudsman at FDA was charged with managing the process to determine how combination products would be assigned. And they developed a regulation, which is Part 3, that we still have today, that set out the request for designation process for combination products, as well as non-combinations, where the regulatory identity of that product as a drug or a device was not clear or was in dispute. So that's all we had for quite a few years from around 1990 through the early 2000s. There were some requests for designations that had been received by the agency where decisions were made. Sometimes, well, let me just say this, there wasn't much transparency at all on those decisions. And I think to the outside world, I often heard that it seemed like this whole process was a bit of a black box because it was a mystery as to why this product was considered, to be regulated as a device and this one a drug, while they might seem pretty similar. So fast forward to 2002, this tidbit of history may not be remembered by most people nowadays, but it was important to me. And that's when FDA initially started out really having a drive to modernize combination product regulation. And that was when the agency developed what we call the Combination Products Program. And that was in very early 2002. And this program was a precursor to what later became the Office of Combination Products in the Office of Commissioner of FDA. And much of the drive at that time had been a relative explosion in the development of drug-coated devices, which are, of course, combination
Really?
products. And especially at that time, what was a really big deal, late 90s, early 2000s, were drug-eluting coronary stents. So these were, being developed by big companies that saw huge market potential because these are widely used products. And there was a significant concern by the device industry based on their early experience that FDA basically didn't have the right policies, procedures, and framework in place to develop these products in a timely manner. And of course, they were interested in getting them approved and on the market as timely as possible. So we, within the agency, on our own initiative, started this combination product program in early 2002, and I was appointed to be its director. And at that point, I was literally, the only employee in the agency who was 100% focused on this issue. It was a program of one. But in parallel, at the same time, in 2002, FDA and industry were working on developing a user fee program for medical devices which was analogous to the PDUFA program, Prescription Drug User Fee Act, that had been in place for drugs and biologics since 1992. So for about 10 years already at that point. And as part of these user fee programs, yeah, nominally they authorize user fees for the review of now device, but also at that time drug and biologic applications. But along with the user fee legislation comes what FDA used to call kind of a Christmas tree of things hanging down from the tree of extra legislation that that industry and FDA as well collaboratively often work on together to augment the regulatory process. And one of those things that came in 2002, lobbying from the device industry, was to establish an Office of Combination Products to ensure that these issues don't go by the wayside. So here we were doing some work on our own in the same period, but once that law was enacted in later in 2002, then FDA had to, by law, establish the Office of Combination Products, and that actually occurred uh, December 24th, 2002. And I was,
So you were,
yeah,
so apologies. So you were as you were setting up the combination product program, there was this parallel effort that was happening in that also helped drive its creation. So you kind of had
yes.
already answered the question to some extent, but there wasn't the formality that OCP was able to give.
Well, yes, that's part of it. But as part of the establishment of the office, it wasn't just having an office, but the office was given defined responsibilities. Uh, and that was to ensure, um, the the way that the combination products were designated and assigned to agency centers. OCP was charged with ensuring the timely and effective pre-market review of combination products by coordinating the review process between the centers, charged with ensuring the consistent and appropriate post-market regulation of combinations. That gets into part 4 ultimately,
B,
CGMPs, adverse event reporting, etc. Some roles about dispute resolution and other things. So it was more than simply what we were doing. I mean, it gave us the that not only the mandate but the ability to really accomplish all the things that we wanted to do.
so it was device led that drove the creation. That's
Yes,
surprising to me.
for the first, at least the first or so 10 years, I'd say that pharma was fairly sleepy when it came to combination products. And I'm happy to get into that more. But the early design and development of combination products and the early interest was really driven by the device industry. And I think it has shifted. So,
Yeah. So because now pharma's all over it.
mhm,
Um,
wasn't always the case.
wasn't always the case. That's interesting. You were talking about PDUFA and MDUFA and the medical device user fee modernization, or another the it sounds like the medical device user fee modernization created the MDUFA process. Yeah.
The the Medical Device User Fee and Modernization Act of 2002, um, besides authorizing user fees for medical devices, also authorized the establishment of OCP and other
Right.
things too. Other changes to the device regulatory process that had nothing to do with combination products.
So what is PDUFA and MDUFA? Because people myself included, we tend to focus on the regulations and guidelines, etc.
Mhm.
PDUFA and MDUFA are um, one step up.
Right. Well, yeah, because they're actually the overarching law that is basically the opportunity for these industries and FDA and Congress to tweak the food and drug law every 5 years, because these laws are enacted with a 5-year sunset period, by which they must be reauthorized or they sunset, and go away. And kind of, nobody really wants that for the most part. because they've done so much to give um, uh, staffing and a lot more consistency in terms of timing expectations to the regulated industry. But besides the ability to collect user fees for the activities, as I kind of alluded to a little bit ago, they the laws, the reauthorizations of these act are the opportunities for Congress, together with the industry and FDA, to further augment the law to do things that may not be currently as easy as they could be, or to recognize areas that maybe hadn't existed yet. I mean, combination products is a good example. And before 1990, the notion of combination product didn't even exist in the law. In 1990, they gave us the notion. Then when development really started to take off, then they gave us more authorities. There, you know, other aspects of the law, like, that have also been tweaked over time during these 5-year periods. So these laws, besides doing user fees, they do a lot of other important things that are probably equally important in terms of how drugs, devices, biologics, and combinations get regulated.
What's the connection between PDUFA, MDUFA, and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act?
They they are basically become like amendments to the act. So there's the overarching act, and it keeps getting larger and larger and larger over time as these other things kind of get passed and then hang on to it. So you'll see in, MDUFA may have a provision, like we already had a, provision for um, what was in the Safe Medical Devices Act about combination products, but then an additional provision to the act, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, got tucked um, in section 503G, had like one line. Now it's several paragraphs. That's kind of the way it's done, and then it keeps building over time.
Were you actually like an active participant in the generation of like some of these activities, MDUFA, PDUFA, the stuff related to combination products?
I'd say I was a participant. I don't know if I go so far as to say active. In terms of
Interesting.
um, there was a lot of discussion in 2002 in terms of what the OCP should ultimately be, and I was involved in some of those discussions based on the work that I had done to date. And if we have time, I can share with you sort of an assessment that we had done that kind of set the ground for what OCP would really tackle and do, and where the priorities were. So that was definitely part of the process in terms of feeding that back. I did have to go to Capitol Hill a couple times for meetings with staffers, nobody famous at the time, as I recall, but I was a bit player in the whole thing, but just sharing, with respect to this one niche issue, what I knew and what my recommendations were. Later, I became involved in the MDUFA negotiating team for the next round of MDUFA, because like I said, this kind of gets renewed every 5 years.
5 years.
So it was originally 2002. Then before 2000, in the couple of years leading up to 2007, there were various working groups to discuss these issues and what might be changed again. So I was involved at that part. A little earlier in my career, I was also involved in one of the PDUFA working groups, supporting our associate commissioner at the time, who was managing the PDUFA process. So I was fairly involved then, but it was pre-OCP.
It's, I imagine, a song and dance of what do you include in the PDUFA, MDUFA? What do you include in regulation, like in a part 4 when that comes out? What do you include in guidance? So there are some things that I didn't understand why you would include something like primary mode of action in something as high level as PDUFA. You said the Safe Medical Devices Act was 90, right?
Correct.
Because I thought there was the PMOA rule in 2005.
Right. So, yeah. So basically, there's a hierarchy, right? So the law is 30,000 foot level. And that's done by Congress, right? I mean, that's the law. So FDA, as a executive agency, its job is to implement the law. And it does that by writing regulations that further interpret and provide instructions for the industry, for example, on how to comply with the law. But the law is usually pretty general. It's like the law would never have like a part four type of detail, because it's just sort of again at the 30,000 foot level. So what the law did in 1990 was it simply gave us those four words, primary mode of action, but it left to the agency to figure out what primary mode of action is. And in that
Oh,
period from 1990 to 2000, and 2000 plus really, there was nothing more than those four words. And then one of the first things we did in OCP was, in fact, it was our first regulation that we issued, first as a proposed rule, then a final rule, was to define primary mode of action. And, as you probably know, I mean, that's defined as basically the most important therapeutic action of a combination product or how it achieves its most important therapeutic effects. And essentially, what we explained was that it's based on the relative contribution of the individual constituent parts of the combination. So if you have a drug and a delivery device, um, the drug is actually what's treating the patient, but the device plays a subordinate role in assisting in its delivery. It doesn't do any treatment in and of its own right, so the drug is primary. On the other hand, a product like the drug-eluting stent that kicked a lot of this off in the early 2000s, a stent without a drug is a standalone product that's used to physically, mechanically hold open a vessel. And the drug basically played a subordinate role in helping kind of tamp down the inflammatory response by the body to that, foreign body uh, that would occur. And the drug therefore helps assist the device in keeping that vessel open so that its PMOA is the device. I mean, those are just two obvious, examples. There's a lot of things in the middle that get tricky. So we define PMOA, but the other thing I just wanted to mention too, because it's really important, is we were increasingly getting confronted with examples of products for which the PMOA was not clear. There were either products where maybe it was like 50-50 between the drug and the device, or 60-40, and we really weren't sure, or examples of products where the product was really doing two completely different things, neither one of which was clearly primary or subordinate. So the other thing we were able to do in the regulation, even though it wasn't in the law, was to say, here's what we're going to do if we can't determine the PMOA with reasonable certainty. And basically, we created this assignment algorithm, as it's known now, that's in 21 CFR 3.4, that explains how we would assign those kinds of combination products.
when you were going to Capitol Hill, you had a laundry list of responsibilities that you thought would be in the OCP purview. Um, I imagine there were things on those lists that didn't come to fruition. I imagine there were other things that were not on your list that were added on. So we know now in 2025 that and you can add to this, the big elements that OCP currently handles is request for designation, cross-center reviews, and then the guidance element, right?
I mean, those are the main thing. I'd say the three main things are the designation process, which OCP is responsible for not only combination products, despite its name, but also non-combinations. Because
Really?
the OCP is the agency's product jurisdiction officer. So if we get a product where it's not clear whether it's a drug or device, even though it's clearly not both, OCP is responsible for that too.
Does
Um,
that happen?
it happens a lot. And I work a lot in that area, actually. Those are some of the toughest questions because it involves whether the article achieves its intended purposes by chemical action or not. It's a very tricky area,
Could you
actually.
give one example? That's very interesting because that to me at face value sounds like a situation that would never happen. But from what you just said, it sounds like it's happening all the time.
I mean, I won't say all the time. It's happening, many such
Enough,
instances a year. Yes.
enough.
Uh, an example. I want to give you an example that I'm confident is publicly available. But there was a product that, and then this information is available online actually, because when I was at FDA, we released it all. But there was a product that was used to basically, it was used in ophthalmic surgery to basically co- create color like a dye, create color to delineate structures during surgery, delicate surgery in the eye. And in Europe, I think it was definitely a European company, as I recall. It's a device because it was determined it wasn't doing anything pharmacological. But when it came over here at FDA, and this went through a number of reviews and appeal cycles that were ultimately sustained, the um, FDA determined that that product achieved its primary intended purposes, not only by means of its color, but it did so because of the way that the um, the agent kind of binded to cells within the eye structure. And because of that, it was determined to be a form of chemical action that did not meet the definition of a device, because the definition of a device, actually, definitions of device and drug are almost the same, but a device cannot achieve its intended purposes by chemical or metabolic action. If you look at the language, that's the main distinguishing factor. And FDA defines chemical action very broadly, and it includes things like weak intermolecular forces, like positive, negative attractions that are not viewed as drug-like in to my knowledge, anywhere else in the world. So there are a number of products that are regulated as devices, as drugs here that are devices elsewhere. So it's a real issue.
Wow. That's interesting. And it's interesting that it would be under the purview of OCP to decide one way or the other. Going back to the list, were there things that you had wanted to be as part of OCP that were ultimately left to the centers?
Um, Not really. I mean, the legislation was pretty broad, and although it didn't give us, I think there was a question as to whether OCP would actually be a review center, if you will, in its own right. Like combination products would just go to OCP for review, and that's still a misnomer by many. I shouldn't say many, by at least some, because I hear it fairly frequently. That, oh, this has to go to OCP because it's a combination product, as if they're going to review it instead of CDER or CBER, and that's not the way it works, as you know. um, OCP is really a policy center or office. It creates the policy. It's like a traffic cop in that it decides you go here, based on your primary mode of action. It helps coordinate and facilitate the review process, especially in situations where the centers might not be playing as well together as they could or should. And that's becoming less frequent because of the maturity of the program now compared to the early days. But they don't review combination products, and that is done by CEDAR or CBER. And I shared that view then, in the formation stage, as I do now. I mean that OCP could never replicate the the breadth and depth of expertise that the centers have collectively. It just wouldn't, it would be a complete waste, really, of resources to try to staff an OCP that only reviewed combination products, but it would, because of the diversity of products, it would have to have nearly, bits of the same expertise residing throughout the, the, the three medical product centers. So I think the way it came down was correct. Um, I could tell you that another thing that had been considered at one time as well was to basically make combination products subject to their own regulatory requirements, distinct from, let's say, NDAs, BLAs, 510Ks, PMAs. Um,
Really?
yeah, I mean, it was considered. It was considered. Um, but I think, again, we landed at the right place. I mean, the
Was that considered seriously?
I don't know how seriously it was considered because it didn't actually happen. but I think there was
Right.
discussion in, for example, public meetings that we held in the early days of OCP, where I think there was a feeling by some in the industry that it would be a force fit to cram a combination product into any one regulatory um, paradigm that wasn't designed for that purpose. And
I mean,
it,
to be fair, it kind of is. That
yeah,
is exactly what we do.
it is what we do, and it is a force fit at times. It doesn't always work. And I could give some examples where it makes it hard. At the same time, I think FDA has proven that it's been able to effectively regulate combination products using the tools that it already has. And because one thing that combination products allow, and Part 4 is a perfect example of this, is to say that even if a combination product is regulated as a drug under an NDA, that FDA has the tools available for a combination product that are associated with the underlying constituent parts. So it can apply device-like requirements through the NDA process, and you're likely familiar with that, with the emphasis on design controls, for example, for combination products, for NDA and BLA regulated products. Um, and similarly, in the device world, often PMAs for combination products, you have drug CMC information and all these other things. So, can it be a force fit? Yes. Can it work though? I believe
It works.
yes, and it has and it does.
Going to how combination products have been accepted. You were talking about how you mentioned how in the early days, it was really the device industry that was driving, further oversight in the combination product space.
Right.
As I was saying, that's really surprising to me just because of the pharma adoption, you could say. I mean, there's still, it's not a one battle by any means. It's not done. Um, but with confidence over the last 10 years, there's been a lot more emphasis internally at companies on combination products.
Mhm.
How have you seen that shift?
I I have seen it shift, and it's a welcome shift, but at the same time surprising to me, because when we first got started with combination products, like I said, it was largely device driven, because a lot of development at that time was um, drug coated devices for the most part. The issue is, and I think what took pharma industry about 5 years to let it sink in, and then maybe even five more after that before they kind of believed it further, was that products that they had been dealing with for a long time were actually combination products. So, for example, prefilled syringes or transdermal patches, which are now recognized as combination products. And that was one of the earliest things OCP did, was to make clear what is and what is not a combination product. It was a surprise to the pharma industry, and they kind of didn't believe it because they considered these to basically be container closures for their drug products. And that's kind of how they were regulated. And they were even reviewed that way within CEDAR. Um, Meter dose inhalers are another example that CEDAR reviewed pretty much exclusively without any involvement from CDRH. They built up a large area of expertise there, which of course they still have. But there wasn't really recognition that these were combination products, at least widely. And I could tell you that when Part 4 was written, there was a lot of pushback from the pharma industry. And at that point, although I was involved in the development of Part 4, it ultimately got published and finalized after I left the agency. So I was a consultant at that point, and I was working with so many pharma companies at that time on implementing these combination product requirements, but they were basically, many of them, and these are big, well-known, established companies that, are very careful to comply with regulatory requirements. They were really of the mind that, well, this isn't a combination product because FDA never told me. So, these are old legacy products. They're not subject to
The-
Part 4.
In other words, they didn't tell me specifically. They just wrote this general regulation about how what combination products are. Well, they didn't call me out.
Right. Or even going back to their review process, even ones that were relatively recent, like we were never told that this was a combination product. So we don't think it really is. And, I had to gently explain to them why, in fact, what the applicability of this rule is. And I know that there was definitely a catch up period for, I'd say, 5-ish years, when part four came out, or at least when it was proposed through the time it was finalized, and then some, for pharma companies to get these legacy products in compliance. So I think that was one reason that the pharma industry, in my opinion, was kind of slow to get on board, is they really didn't think they even had combination products. The second thing is, I think that once, whether it's because of the involvement or, with drugs coming off patent and with the risk of going generic, um, I saw an increasing trend where pharma really started to think, what can devices do for us? And they have, and there are definitely good examples of products where new modes of delivery, often enabled by devices, breathe new life into even old, already generic drug products. And now, we see tons of 505(b)(2)s for products like this, that they're already an approved drug product, but now there's a better way to deliver it that's either more local, um, easier to deliver at home, through auto injectors. All of these things, I think, have really moved pharma much more along. And I'd say in my own work, I spend more time on pharma-led combination products today than I do with device-led, which is a flip-flop, um, over these years for sure.
Yeah. How much do you think the enforcement discretion played into it? Because I remember the Amgen warning letter, and I
Mhm.
remember the Meridian warning letter. Those two were sent waves, I think, across the industry beyond what Part 4 by itself did.
Right.
It seemed like all
No,
of a sudden, all the colleagues that I was talking to from other companies, even, um, the resources started to open up a lot more for increasing, establishing competence in combination product.
right. And it's good that that happened, because it, FDA often uses warning letters as enforcement tools, and as training basically for the industry. It's directed at a specific company for their actions, but they are really meant, be, they're made public for a reason. And one of those reasons is that it does help share what the agency's expectations are in this regard. I think part of the delay was, just as this was all very new for industry, it was also new for FDA. And what FDA had to do in parallel with the release of Part 4 was, um, training for its field staff, to be able to understand Part 4 and implement it. And for a long time, I'm not sure I have any real recent examples of this that I've confronted, but I have definitely worked with companies that, um, e- even though part four is fully in place way after the warning letters and everything else, that are basically getting inspected as if there is no part four. If it's a drug product, they're being inspected to part 211, and they don't get device questions. I'm not going to say this is in the present, but I'd say up until at least a few years ago, I was still hearing examples like this, on occasion, where it just, seems like the message didn't get fully out, to the FDA field at times, for whatever reason.
Could you maybe describe really quickly the office versus center at FDA, and also the field, like the inspectors? Because it sounds like it's not, I mean, FDA to industry, it's all FDA, right? Yeah, there are different offices, and they have a hierarchy and structure just like every organization does.
Right.
It's lost maybe in translation that we're talking about tens of thousands of people.
Sure. So it's smaller number of people, unfortunately, than it was at the start of the year. I
Right.
think I just saw a number. I feel like something that related to the shutdown that we're currently under, that I just saw, that I feel like there might be. I thought I saw 15,000 employees listed somewhere.
Mm.
So I don't quote me on that, but I think I just saw that yesterday. I think that's kind of the right number. But yeah, the agency is organized into, at the highest level is centers, and we have biologics, devices, drugs, foods, veterinary medicine, and tobacco. And then there's offices that are below each of those centers. OCP is a little bit different because one of the main offices off um, at the agency level is the office of the commissioner. So that includes the commissioner, and now his, immediate staff, but there's many offices under that are like cross-cutting things that affect the
So it's
whole
like central
agency.
central command.
Yeah, you could think it's sort of like corporate in a way,
Yeah.
like things like personnel or whatever that are not center specific in a company. It's kind of like that. So the OCP was in one of those offices together with things like orphan products, which handles both orphan drugs and humanitarian devices, good clinical practices, these kinds of offices, pediatric therapeutics, et cetera. They're in, the general office of the commissioner. But within each center, they have their own offices, like the Office of New Drugs, where new drugs are reviewed, versus the Office of Generic Drugs. And then there's in CDRH, they have the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, or OPEC, that has responsibility for compliance and surveillance and pre-market review of devices, et cetera. And separate from that, and this is where you're going to test me a little bit, because this is an area I haven't closely followed, but historically for years, there's an Office of Regulatory Affairs, which was quote unquote the field. There was a headquarters component to that where all the policy is done and things like that, but they had, their tentacles all through the country, in terms of
The world.
district, yeah, the world now, right? But the district offices and the residence posts that are local offices that would come to do the actual inspections. Now there was a reorganization a few years ago, and because I'm more like pre-market focused than inspections, like I don't know the subtleties of that, but I think that they're more um closely aligned with the centers for their areas of responsibility they used to be. I believe it's still a separate office, but I'm just not, um, I don't follow that area that closely. But that's, historically they are separate though from the centers, and they're still not center employees to the best of my knowledge.
You've been in industry now for more than 10 years. I think what's interesting about your background is that you were in industry, then you went to FDA, then you went back into
Hmm.
industry, then you went back
Hmm.
into FDA, and then you went back into industry.
Yeah.
And you've been consulting for a little while now. Combination products has shifted. I've seen since part 4 came out,
Hmm.
it has shifted meaningfully as far as adoption, as far as importance, as far as frameworks and guidance. It's shifted, but gaps still remain. So, what are
Hmm.
the regulatory policy, you could say, gaps that still could make a difference for us in industry, but also regulators?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, here we are 20 years now after the establishment of OCP. I'd say that the most significant regulatory gaps have been closed, including the PMOA rule, the GMP rule, the adverse event reporting rule. OCP has released about 25 guidance documents on various regulatory and procedural issues, on a wide range of things, from its own activities like the RFD process. It has defined chemical action and a classification guidance. There's guidance on injector pens, the bridging guidance, EDDOs, HF, human factors issues, et cetera. So this has all helped a lot. That's not to say that no gaps remain. And I think, one major gap that I've written several articles about, that it's always been an area that I've cared about a lot for some reason, involves the agency's what's called a cross-labeling policy. Cross-labeling is basically a regulatory conundrum where if, let's say, a device is intended to be used with a drug or vice versa, where that other product would be used in a way that's not in accordance with its approved labeling, then that first product can't get approved unless there's a second product for it to be used with that's also on label for it. And I encounter this issue a lot in my work, both when I was at FDA and especially since then. It can involve a situation where a pharma company, for example, wants to use an off-the-shelf delivery device in a manner for which it's not approved, and they may unwittingly have to take on the responsibility for that device and get it approved for that purpose if the device company isn't interested in doing that. There's a lot of legal, kind of thorny legal and regulatory issues involved in this. And FDA has literally been working on this for 20 years, in my experience. And a couple of years ago, I got excited because an interview with the OCP director at the time, he said that there'd be a cross-labeling policy, cross-labeling guidance issued later that year, but that was 3-4 years ago and it still hasn't happened. So I think that's definitely a gap. Another area that can be confusing for companies is basically, and I think they learn it by tribal knowledge or by specifically asking FDA, but there's not a real lot of good guidance on when various development activities need to be addressed for the secondary component within the first component's review process. This is like the force fit issue. Nowhere does it say, for example, when various design control activities have to be done with respect to phases 1, 2, or 3, the way they would
Right.
for
Yeah. Yeah.
certain drug elements. So that remains, a constant source of confusion.
Is
And
th- is that one is that one also a gap on the drug side? Because industry has coined this term. I don't know where it's defined. Phase dependent GMPs. I don't know if you've heard
right,
this terminology before. Um, it's not actually defined anywhere. So
right.
it's kind of the same. It cuts to both sides, I feel like.
It does, yeah, and that's exactly my experience as well. Um, Another example is, I alluded to this before, but that chemical action issue, which is the distinction between a device and a drug, is one that continues to be really unclear. We do have a guidance that FDA finalized in 2017 called the classification guidance that has a brief definition of chemical action. And they basically said in that, well, it's just like pharmacological action, like everybody thinks about it. But truthfully, it is more complicated than that. And like I said, there's still many examples, including current examples of products that are devices outside the US that are drugs here because of this. Um, Finally, like another issue that I'll just mention is, and this is a really mundane one, but as something simple as registration and listing, which is just a routine compliance activity for all FDA products, pretty much, certainly all the medical products. It's really not clearly articulated how registration and listing should be handled for combination products. You can find one PowerPoint online from on a CDRH website that kind of discusses how it should be done. You kind of have to call them specifically because the database doesn't really allow you to do it. The pharma side, I've seen some talks that people have given, but it's just not really formalized at all. And yet this is something that every company with a combination product has to do. And I think the default is just follow the drug way. If you're approved as a drug, follow the device way if you're approved as a device, but it can be a little bit more complicated than that. So I think in the big picture, like every area that's different between drugs and devices in terms of the law, the regulations, the policies, the guidance, ultimately, they're all gaps at some point that ultimately need to get clarified. But there's just, it would be boiling the ocean. So I think it's gonna, I think OCP and the agency appropriately have um, tried to prioritize to handle the biggest ticket items first.
On the last one, that's a really interesting one. I think sites are also related because the way that the facility registrations, like the categories that you have, they're different between drug and device, and there is no reconciliation of the two. Like if you're primarily a drug company, most of your sites are probably registered as drug sites in one way, shape, or form, whatever designation they're giving. And if they're device, it's vice versa, and there isn't any clarity around the site registration.
I agree with you. I think this is an area that can be unclear. For people on the ground that are in companies that are charged with this kind of work, it can be challenging because there's really nowhere to go to find a clear answer.
Where can people find you, Mark?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I have a profile there, and I'm also a principal consultant at Eloquent Life Sciences, formerly Greenleaf Health. And I understand you'll make my email available in the show materials.
Yep, put it in the show notes. Thanks for coming on, Mark.
It was really good to be with you. Thank you.